Okay, the first texture we're going to be taking a look at and creating is a reference from this bark image that we have here. And we're going to be creating a fully seamless texture out of this. In other words, both a vertical and horizontal seamless texture. And this is a fairly simple texture to create, like I was saying. It mostly involves the clone stamp tool. And we'll just go ahead and get started on that. And it's pretty simple. The first thing we want to do is go up to our filters, and what we're going to be able to do is offset our texture so that we can see what it's going to look like when the seams match up. So we're going to select from filter up on top, go to other, go to offset. And this gives us two different options. We have both horizontal and vertical. And what we pretty much want to do is center both the vertical and the horizontal so we can see sort of a crosshair in the center of our actual texture, and click OK. Now, depending too on what type of software you're going to be using for these textures, sometimes you need to make square textures, and in that case you might want to crop it first. We're not going to worry about it. We're going to work with pretty much just the native texture here, just the native size. And let's grab our toolbar over here. And what we want to do is start removing some of these areas. So you can see there's a few lightness problems conflicting in the vertical seamless, where what we're going to have to do is actually lighten up some of these areas and maybe darken some of them so they blend a little bit better and we don't have such a large tiling effect. And because of that, what we can actually do now is delete our offset from our history, and we're going to go back and run that filter again. But this time we're going to set our vertical to 0, and we're just going to work on the horizontal right now. And click OK. And this is going to make it a lot easier since we don't really have too much of a coloration issue. We can see that our colors right here can also be found right here with not too much or too large of a difference. So if we just zoom in using our navigator, and we'll go ahead up to the top, and now we're going to select our clone stamp tool. And if we come now over to the left of our toolbar, you can see that our clone stamp tool is selected. There's also a pattern stamp tool, so make sure that the clone stamp tool is selected and not the pattern stamp tool. Now what we need to do is hold down Alt on the keyboard, or if you have a thumb button on your mouse or an extra button on your mouse, you can program that to be Alt, which is a much more productive way of doing it, because then you can click and select sample areas much quicker. What we want to do is hold down Alt, and you can see our cursor changes. And I'll do that over in the layers panel so we can see that a little bit better. Drag that over. Of course, that doesn't show up too well, so we'll go to the lighter area. We just see that we have this extra little change in the way our tool looks, and then what we want to do is select an area that we want to sample. In other words, what do we want to be cloning from? And I kind of like this area over here, so I'm going to hold down Alt and click this area over on the right, sort of down to the middle. And then all we have to do is just start moving around our mouse, holding it down. We can see that it's cloning the area. Let's take a look at our brush settings by right mouse clicking. And right now I have our master diameter set to 51 pixels and our hardness to 55. Now really depending on how crisp the texture is, you might want to set your hardness maybe a little bit higher. We can set it up to 70. And then our diameter should be fine at 51 right now because we don't need a very large area. Another thing we also have checked on is aligned, and I'll show you how that works in just a sec. But first what we want to do is go along this area and just remove this seam. And what we want to work with is pretty much our spacing between different areas of the bark, with sort of the cracks in there. And what we can do is just go around those edges, and that way we can define some of these areas through both edges, the ones that already exist and the ones we're cloning, and so we have sort of an area to end off at, and we don't have to worry about it looking sort of weird and like look like we clone stamped it or look like it's photoshopped. So zoom in here just a little bit lower. We can still see that seam in there, but I'm going to show you the difference between aligned and aligned off. And basically what it is with aligned on, we can sample any area. I'll grab this lighter piece of bark right here and go in and just start sort of drawing that area in over here. Now if I let go of the mouse and then come up top here a little bit above where we were just sampling and click, you can see that it's not the same thing we're sampling, and actually we're aligned, which is where the tool gets its name, that little option. We're lined up with where we left off. So no matter where we start up, it's going to remember where we left off in this part of the sample. So that can be good, and it can sometimes be bad, especially if you're working with a very small area to sample and you don't want to go outside the boundaries. So let's just go ahead and delete those clones, and let's check off aligned and take a look and see what happens. I'll go back to that lighter area of the bark, and I'll just start drawing that out and kind of make that a little more visible, and then let go, and I'm going to come next to it and start painting again. And you can see now we're sampling from the same area that we had before. So right where we clicked Alt is exactly where we're sampling. Every single time we click this mouse button and start painting out the area, it's going to select from that same section. So with aligned, we have it remembering where we left off, so we can continue something if we wanted to, or we can check off aligned and then go ahead and start painting duplicates of certain areas, exact duplicates. So it'll always start out in the same space, and it really depends on what your preferences are. I usually leave aligned on because it is very helpful, especially when you're working on a texture like this. Let's go back now and zoom in sort of around these seams, and we can see we do have some problems that are caused by the lens of the camera, and that is a little bit of a blurring on the edges. If we take a look at more towards the center of the image, and this would be, since it's a picture of a tree trunk, we have a closer area to the lens, and then what's on the side would be farther away from the lens. Now, depending on the f-stop setting or the aperture settings of the camera, they will be crisper in the center, and then you might have some distortion and some blurring on the edges. In this case, we do. And we can fix that pretty easily. It depends whether or not you want to leave it. That really depends on how closely you're going to be zoomed into this texture, and if that really matters. In this case, what we can do is, since these are very heavily blurred areas, we will be grabbing other crisper areas of the bark to sort of put in that area so that we don't have to worry about all that blurring along the edge. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that you're not grabbing areas of this bark that are way too distinctive, things that stand out too much. In this case, we have this large piece that's a much lighter piece than the rest, and it does stand out more than the rest. So what we want to do is actually remove that piece entirely because we don't need it. And if we left it in as part of our texture, what would happen is it would produce a tiling effect. If we were to repeat this texture several times, that is a very distinctive area that will show up every single time the texture is repeated. Now, most of the time, that's pretty much standard. Tiling is going to happen with any texture, no matter what, unless, of course, you're working with maybe a basic fractal texture that you create, or something computer generated. But when you're working with actual images, tiling is going to happen, and there's really not much you can do to avoid that. What we can do, though, is we can reduce the tiling effect, which is done by removing elements that are very distinctive and stand out and that are far too unique to be placing over a large item, or in this case, since we have a bark, on a tree, because that way every couple of sections up the trunk we would see that some of these distinctive items would be showing up more frequently than other things, and at least standing out a lot more. So what I want to do is grab an area that's rather dull, doesn't really stand out too much, and I'll start by holding down Alt and clicking on this area down here, and we can use that starting in the center and just sort of brush that out. As you can see, we're sort of blending along with the cracks, and in this case it's another easy texture because it is so random that it doesn't have to be perfect, and chances are you will not be able to tell if any mistakes are made, and you won't be able to tell that this texture was clone stamped when we're finished, just because there's so many variations within the bark. There's so much we can do with it, and it won't really show up. We're just outlining these cracked areas. Another thing is too, you don't want to sample the same area too many times, because that also can increase the cloned look and the tiling look. As you can see, we have this sort of distinct, and it might be noticeable that that is copied over, which is what we're trying to reduce, is that copied look. So what we can do is not just grab that entire sample and leave that there, but also grab from another area now and sort of add to it and remove that. And now it looks completely different, or at least mostly different from that other crack that we had. So you want to be grabbing from different areas of your texture always, at least with a texture like this, as much as possible, so that you don't have all those weird tiling effects with it, and so it has the variation to produce a good seamless texture. So we'll just go in here and we're working along the cracks once again. We're also removing some of this blurring that's in there. Now I have a large enough piece of that sampled, so I'll go ahead and Alt-click somewhere else and sort of draw in some more areas. And by going back and forth from left to right across this texture, we are also grabbing a little bit of that color change. Because you've noticed with the lighting, it might be a little bit lighter on this side and a little bit darker on this. And we could always fix that overall tone with this kind of texture. That's not really necessary. All we have to do is pretty much when we're cloning down the center, just grab from back and forth on each side, and it will blend together very nicely once we're finished. We can already see that seam is mostly disappearing, and we can hardly even tell what we worked on. So I'll grab from another area over here. We'll just fill that in. And we've got the blurring coming out kind of far, so we want to work on that as much as we can, but not remove or copy too much from the same area. So we'll do a little bit from the right, and then we'll grab a little bit from the left. Come in here and just kind of remove those areas. And since we've only offset on the horizontal, and we're not really worrying about the vertical just yet, I'm going to go ahead and just clone this all the way down to the bottom, because we're actually going to be removing a large section of both the top and the bottom of this image so that the vertical will blend together nicely. And you can see the difference in the crispness between the cracks if you really take a look at how our texture is sort of blurred a little here, but we have it very crisp right here. But we'll be fixing that and doing some different types of clones once we start working on the vertical part of the seamless texture. So now I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. And now we can hardly even tell there was a seam there. I can't really tell exactly where I worked on it, and that's a very good thing. Okay, so now we want to work on the vertical, because we have our horizontal, and to show you that that is entirely perfect, we can go to Other, select Offset, and now if we play around with our horizontal, no matter where we put that now, it's going to blend in with each other, and there is no seam. One thing you may notice is that we have this sort of strip here, and that may be something we want to remove as far as the color. We're going to worry about that just a little bit later if it's needed, just because those are so close to the edges. And when we're working on the vertical, since this texture I consider to be more vertically oriented, because our bark is growing with long stripes, or long strips of bark going up and down, cloning the vertical is going to be a little more important than the actual horizontal. So we'll just set this pretty much anywhere for the horizontal, it doesn't really matter, and select our vertical, and just pretty much play around with that, making sure you have the preview on. If you don't, if you're not seeing that preview, that's because that's not checked on. And we'll just go ahead and leave it at that right now. And we have a -1667, and click OK. So now we can start working on the vertical clone. And by separating both the horizontal and the vertical in different sweeps instead of doing it all at once, it allows us to sort of isolate different tonal changes, which you'll notice more with some of the other textures that we'll be working on. This one, like I said, it's not very noticeable. We can grab from certain areas up and down. It's such a random texture that it doesn't really matter too much. So now I'm going to increase our brush, right mouse click, and select our master diameter up to 65. Just make it a little bit larger. It doesn't have to be too big or too small. And once again, that's also based on a lot of preference if you do a lot of work in Photoshop or you have before. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I want to continue this sort of darker stripe down into this area and continue along, matching up what we can see. We already have some of these seams sort of matching up, or some of these cracks matching up. So I'm going to use that to my advantage and sort of carry along with that, because that will, of course, be a much more natural seamless texture. What I'm also going to do is decrease the hardness just a little, so we have a little bit more blending within our cracks. So I want to hold down Alt and click and just sort of copy these areas over. And we don't have to be extremely precise about it. And actually, in this case, since we have more of this lighter area on the bottom than we do the darker area, and since it's a little more plain, I'm going to be using that bottom area to clone upward into this area and keep that blending change. You also might even have a little bit of blurring on our vertical and not just on the horizontal, not just on the sides. We will have it on the top and the bottom of our image. But blurring doesn't seem to be too bad, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. But I want to grab a bit of our texture up here and just kind of fill in these areas up to the cracks. Just drawing out what I can, just to sort of blend that, just as we did before. And like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to get too precise about it. And really, depending too on how many textures you're creating, you really should be done by now when you're working on a texture like this, if you're working on a whole bunch of them. I'm kind of taking my time so you can really see how it's done, but usually you can go through a texture like this fairly quickly, just because it is so simple. And once you do it enough times, you really get a hang of it, then you're able to go through these textures very quickly, especially if you have a large project you have to do and you have to go through the textures very quickly. Right now, one thing you'll notice is that I can't really access certain parts of the image zoomed in because of our toolbars. And normally I'm used to working on triple monitor, so it's a little bit distracting, but one little trick you can do is just unmaximize that and just minimize this window, so then we can zoom in and then work with that as sort of a floating window, which works just as good. If you are going to be doing a lot of work with Photoshop, I would highly recommend having more than one monitor, because Photoshop is something that you can drag all your panels onto a different monitor. And actually, I normally have everything maximized on 3 different monitors, which can be very helpful when you're working on things like this. And it definitely will speed up your productivity and your workflow. So it's something to consider if you're going to be heavily working in Photoshop on projects like this. It also helps within 3D as well. Okay, I'm just gonna continue this area. We can see we have a nice blend in here. You can barely even tell there was a seam going through that side, but we'll go ahead and grab that. And we do sort of want to watch our horizontal. As you can see, I just cloned an area that affected this, what would be the horizontal part once we move that back, or at least on the up and down, perhaps. And what we want to make sure we're doing is just not interfering with too much on the edges. You don't want to edit on the edge, and technically that would be our vertical when we offset it. But we don't want to mess around too much with the edges. You just want to subtly do it, and then if it needs work, you can just play around with the offset, sort of move that around, and then see what works best. Okay, we've pretty much got that side done. And now we can move over here and grab some of these pieces of our bark. And we'll just clone that up and see if we missed any part of that seam. One thing you could do too, even though it is sort of difficult to tell even where we were working now, just zoom in as close as you can, and you might pick up extra little bits of seam in there. And you can just go ahead and change that. And we can't really see the seams, so it should be fine. So let's take a look at the overall texture, and we can sort of see the seam on this part right here. So we'll just zoom in, and we want to work on just sort of moving that upward and blending that into a bigger piece along those areas, so it doesn't look like it's all broken up and that we're working around a seam. And one thing you'll notice by sampling from the same area too many times, I've just created a copy of the same part 5 times in a row, which is actually from down here. So that's another good reason why you want to be grabbing from other different parts of your image and getting a little bit of variation in there. And that looks pretty good when we zoom it out. I'm going to go ahead and go back to our filter, select offset, and just play around with it, moving it, seeing if we missed anything by editing our edges, because normally we want to stay away from our edges. But I did do a little bit of editing, and you are going to have to get that to blend. But it doesn't look like we screwed anything up, and overall it looks really good. And it looks like this is going to be a very good seamless texture if we get everything going right. I'll just go ahead and leave it right there, click OK. And then once you pretty much finish up all your cloning, since we have a working seamless texture right now, we can go ahead and do some overall color adjustments, brightness and contrast, levels if we need to. Levels would be a good thing to start with. You can hit Control L on the keyboard, and if that's not your keyboard shortcut to pull up levels, you can go up to Image, Adjustments, and then select Levels, which is up on top. What we can do here is we'll try to drag this out of the way so we can see most of the image. And we want to drag our right slider up just a little, and that's going to sort of increase our contrast. And then we'll grab our middle slider down to compensate for that brightness that we're creating, but we still have a little bit more contrast in there. And then if you want to darken it up maybe a little, you could always drag that first one down. But you don't want to make too big of a change because most of the photo captures exactly how it's going to look. But if we take a look at the difference, it looks a little more washed out before than it does now. So we'll leave it right there and click OK. Now we can talk about some of the other maps. With a texture like this, it's fairly simple to create other maps for it. The only other map we would really need for this is a bump map. So now we have our color map, and we can use our color map to create a bump map with no special changes that need to be done. I'm going to take our background layer and drag it down to the bottom here, and this second one right next to our little trash bin. And I'll just let go once that's dragged over. And what that's going to do is just create a copy of our layer. And you always want to take and make a copy once you have that final one finished. And even maybe make another copy in case you mess one up. You always have your original. And then you probably want to save it too, since that actually is going to be our color image. And we also want to make sure that we're not offsetting anymore once we start making our other image maps, like bump maps, diffusion maps, and things like that. Basically with our bump map, a bark texture is pretty straightforward. We have our dark areas where it's going to be the lowest part of the bump, and the lighter areas where it's going to be the highest. And with a bark texture like this, it's already done for you. You don't really need to do anything to it at all. One thing I'm going to do is change our color on it, because we don't want it to be colorized. It needs to be black and white. I'm going to select our gradient map, which is under Image, Adjustments, Gradient Map. And then we just make sure and select our either the first or the third sample. And if these aren't in here, you can actually create these yourself. You just go ahead and click on that bar right there, and that'll allow you to create your own gradient, which you can do on the bottom here by defining whatever colors you want it to be. So depending on how much contrast maybe you want in that image. Go ahead and click OK. And this is also a much better method to create the black and white by using the gradient map and not using desaturate, because you'll lose a lot of your intensity and some of your different colors won't convert correctly to grayscale. So gradient map's a good way to create black and white images for both photographs too. If you're working on photographs, that's also a much better way. But now what we want to do is adjust our levels on our gradient map, since it's a little bit different than the color, and I'm just going to brighten that up so we have a nice big change between the light and the dark areas. And click OK. And now we have our bump map. And one of the nice things about these grayscale maps too is this can also double as a diffusion map. depending if you even use diffusion maps, sometimes you don't have to, but you can add this as a diffusion and add it as a bump map as well. As far as any other maps that need to be created for, in this case, a bark texture, there really aren't any. We don't have any reflection or transparency, so we don't really have to worry about that. And there's no specularity on this bark. And if we did want to add a little, that would be an overall value and nothing specific. So this texture is pretty much done. And we can go ahead and save these out, so we can have our color map for the bark and our bump map, which also can double as a diffusion map. And you might want to type that in as well. That is a universal grayscale map of that texture.